The candle on the writing desk had guttered to almost nothing, its flame shivering against the cold breath sliding beneath the library door. The Duke of Ashworth hadn't stirred. His fingers lay on the same page of the same ledger he'd opened an hour ago, though his eyes had long since abandoned the figures. He wasn't studying columns of income and expenditure. He was watching the hands of the woman who had just placed his tea at the desk's corner. Hands that moved with an exactness he couldn't account for, setting the saucer down without the smallest kiss of porcelain against porcelain, withdrawing as soundlessly as they'd arrived. Agnes Thornbury did not lift her eyes to his as she stepped back. She never did. And yet, in the fleeting instant before she turned for the door, something in the tilt of her wrist, in the held stillness of her retreating shoulders, stirred a memory so deeply interred it surfaced not as thought, but as raw sensation. Smoke. The copper tang of blood. The pressure of fingers forcing linen into torn flesh in the dark. He opened his mouth. She pulled the door shut behind her, and the library, enormous, walled with 10,000 volumes, had never felt so profoundly hollow. 7 years had passed since the Crimea. Percival Pemberton, 5th Duke of Ashworth, had spent nearly all of them searching. The war had stripped from him what wars always strip: certainty, peace, the comfortable faith that the world follows comprehensible rules. But it had also left him something he never requested and could not surrender: a debt. He recalled little of the night itself. The siege of Sevastopol had dissolved into a pandemonium of fire and shrapnel and shrieking horses. He'd been struck not by a bullet, but by a beam, a burning timber crashing across his shoulder as the field hospital tent erupted in flame. He remembered the heat. He remembered canvas ripping apart. And he remembered hands. Small hands, impossibly strong, seizing his coat and hauling him through frozen mud while the world blazed orange at his back. A voice. Low, steady, English. Not the accent of an officer's wife, but something rougher, more northern, commanding him to lie still, to breathe, to let her work. She had cauterized the wound herself. He knew this because the army surgeon who examined him the next morning said so with open astonishment, noting that whoever had performed it possessed either formal training or instinct verging on genius. By dawn, she was gone. No name in any register, no face he could reconstruct with certainty. Only the memory of those hands and that voice and the scar on his left shoulder that throbbed each winter like a second heartbeat. He had hired investigators. He had written to every military hospital between Scutari and Balaclava. He had made quiet inquiries through the web of officers' wives who had served as nurses alongside Miss Nightingale's detachment. Nothing. The woman who had saved the Duke of Ashworth's life had disappeared as completely as if she had never drawn breath. Percival, raised since childhood to believe that every problem yields to sufficient money and resolve, found himself facing a possibility he had no training for. Some debts cannot be repaid, not because the creditor refuses payment, but because the creditor cannot be found. It was his mother, the Dowager Duchess, who first suggested the search had ceased to be about gratitude. Quote, zero quote. Her voice that evening over dinner carried the particular dryness she kept for truths her son was not yet prepared to hear. Quote 1. Quote, he made no reply. The Dowager returned to her soup. The subject was not raised again. Meanwhile, Agnes Thornbury brought his tea each morning at 8:30, drew the curtains in the east-facing rooms at precisely 7, and moved through Ashworth Park with the studied invisibility that separated an excellent servant from a merely adequate one. She had come 2 years prior, carrying a letter of character from a Mrs. Eldon of Harrogate, a letter that was, in every material respect, genuine. Mrs. Eldon had indeed employed a quiet young woman by that name for 14 months. What the letter failed to disclose, because Mrs. Eldon herself had no knowledge of it, was that Agnes Thornbury had not always carried that name. She entered the world as Agnes Martell, the youngest daughter of a country surgeon in Northumberland, a man who taught her everything before death claimed him: the treatment of wounds, the setting of bones, the careful application of common herbs against fever and infection. When war arrived, she volunteered under a fabricated surname, Ashby, because unmarried women of no particular standing found few doors open into nursing detachments, and because her father's debts, accumulated through the grinding final years of his illness, had turned the Martell name into a synonym for shame across the county where she'd drawn her first breath. 11 months she served. By her own restrained count, she had preserved perhaps a dozen lives. Among them, a duke she never identified as such. He had been buried beneath blood and mud, the insignia on his coat scorched past recognition. And then she returned home, changed her name once more, buried Agnes Ashby beside Agnes Martell in the same unmarked grave, became Agnes Thornbury, a woman possessing no past worth speaking of, no future worth dreaming toward. She had never intended to arrive at Ashworth Park. A registry in York had offered the position. She accepted because the wages were honest and the house stood far enough from Northumberland to render discovery improbable. Only on her 3rd day, overhearing the housekeeper, Mrs. Calloway, reference the Duke's war injury in passing, did cold comprehension settle upon her like frost forming across glass. That evening, she sat in her narrow room beneath the eaves, perched on the edge of her bed, hands pressed flat to her knees, breathing with deliberate slowness, deciding. She could leave, find another position in another house in another county entirely, or she could remain, trusting the vast, uncrossable distance between a duke and a housemaid to keep her secret exactly where it belonged, in the dark, beneath the surface, where it could wound neither of them. She chose to stay. For 2 years, that choice held firm. The first crack appeared on a Tuesday in late November. One of the footmen, a young man called Daniels, laid his palm open on a shattered carriage lamp. The wound ran deep, bleeding freely. Chaos overtook the servants' hall, the cook pressing a dishcloth against the gash, the scullery maid weeping, Mrs. Calloway dispatching someone for the village physician. Agnes moved without thought. She took Daniels's hand, examined the cut with a steadiness that silenced every voice in the room, cleaned it with boiled water, and wrapped it in strips of fresh linen, folded in a pattern so precise, so unmistakably professional, that Mrs. Calloway stared at her for a full 10 seconds before words returned. "Where on earth did you learn to do that, girl?" Agnes offered a small, closed smile, one that yielded nothing. She said only that her father had been partial to practical knowledge. The matter was left there. But that evening, over port in the dining room, Mrs. Calloway mentioned it to the Duke. Percival said nothing at the time, yet the following morning, when Agnes brought his tea, he watched her hands with sharper attention than before. He noticed how she folded the napkin, not with a servant's careless efficiency performing a habitual task. With deliberate, measured folds. The folds of someone trained to prepare bandages. He noticed faint stains along her fingertips, not from polish, not from blacking, from something vegetal, something herbal, something that struck him with a jolt that nearly sent his cup sideways, as belonging to the field hospitals, where women had crushed yarrow and comfrey between their fingers before pressing poultices against wounds that refused to stop bleeding. He told himself he was being absurd. A housemaid who could dress a cut proved nothing beyond a practical upbringing. He repeated this with the same conviction he had carried for 7 years, that his search for the woman who saved him was merely a matter of honor. He believed it about as thoroughly. The second fracture arrived 3 weeks later, a night when storm descended upon Ashworth Park with such violence that window panes shuddered in their frames and the dogs crawled whimpering beneath the furniture. Percival had not slept through thunder in years. The sound dragged him back every time, to the bombardment, to shells splitting frozen ground. He was standing at his study window when a moving light caught his eye in the herb garden below. Past midnight, rain falling in curtains, and there, coatless in the downpour, was Agnes Thornbury. She was cutting rosemary by the glow of a lantern she'd hung from the gate. He watched her for several minutes. She moved with intention, not haste, selecting stems, cutting them clean, gathering them into a folded cloth. Something in her bearing, in the way her shoulders braced against the rain, told him this was not a servant running an errand. This was someone who could not sleep. Someone who had gone to the one place that still made sense to her, performing an act so deeply worn into habit that it demanded nothing of the mind, and therefore gave back something like stillness. He knew that posture. He had stood at this exact window the same way across 100 wakeful nights, staring into darkness, waiting for the noise inside his skull to quiet. The next morning, he asked Mrs. Calloway whether Miss Thornbury had taken to tending the herb garden. Mrs. Calloway looked surprised. She admitted the garden had been unusually well kept of late, but said she'd assumed the groundsman's boy deserved the credit. Percival offered no further comment. Yet from that day forward, something shifted in the nature of his attention. He began to see Agnes not merely as a presence occupying a room, she had always been that, but as a person contained within that presence. He noticed she flinched, barely perceptibly, at any sudden loud sound. He noticed the stillness she carried was not shyness, but something practiced, deliberate, the careful economy of a woman who had taught herself to take up as little space as the world would allow. He noticed that when she believed no one was looking, her face changed. The pleasant, neutral mask fell away. What replaced it was something far more layered, something that looked unmistakably like grief held at careful distance. And he found himself wanting, with a sharpness that disturbed him, to know its source. He began inventing reasons to linger in whatever room she was cleaning. He began taking tea later, so their crossing paths in the library stretched from the usual half-minute to a full minute. Then 2. He posed small, cautious questions about the household, about the garden, about the book he'd caught her reading when he'd walked unannounced into the servants' sitting room. She answered with the same quiet steadiness she carried into everything, offering precisely enough to satisfy courtesy, not one syllable beyond. But once, when he mentioned the Crimea in passing, a reference to a letter from a former officer, He saw her hands clench on the tray, saw the blood drain from her knuckles, saw the single, fractured instant in which her composure split like ice over rushing water before she gathered herself and quietly withdrew. It lasted less than a heartbeat, but he saw it. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 3 underscore, underscore. The Dowager Duchess remarked one afternoon, her gaze never lifting from her embroidery. They were in the morning room. Agnes had just departed after delivering fresh flowers, lavender and chamomile, arranged with an instinct for harmony that bore no resemblance to the usual careless efforts of the household staff. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 4 underscore, 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 quote, underscore, 5. Underscore, underscore, Percival replied in a voice that would have persuaded anyone who did not know him. The Dowager set her needle down. He did not answer at once. When he spoke, his voice carried an uncertainty she had seldom heard from him. Quote 8, quote 9, the Dowager said softly. Quote 10. The crisis, when it came, arrived not through revelation, but through emergency. It was a brutal February evening when Polly, the youngest kitchen maid, barely 19, crumpled to the scullery floor. Her fever raged so fiercely that her skin scorched beneath any hand that touched it. Each breath she drew was shallow, torn, desperate. The village physician sat 3 miles away, behind roads sheathed in ice. Mrs. Calloway sent a boy on horseback all the same, her face drained of colour. But everyone gathered in the servants' hall understood the same terrible arithmetic. The girl needed help now, not in an hour. Agnes did not wait for permission. She did not seek instruction. She walked into the kitchen, cleared the long table, called for boiling water and clean cloths, and began working with a composure so complete, so commanding, that not a single soul in that room thought to challenge her. She examined the girl, listened to her chest, prepared a tincture from the herbs she had been cultivating in the garden, herbs that, it now became unmistakably clear, had never been intended for seasoning. They were medicine. She spoke to Polly in a low, unwavering voice. The same voice she had used 7 years before, in the choking dark of a burning field hospital, telling a man she did not know to lie still, to breathe, to let her work. Percival reached the kitchen 12 minutes later, driven there by a breathless footman. He stopped dead in the doorway. What he saw before him contradicted everything he believed about the woman he had been watching for weeks. Agnes was bent over the kitchen maid, sleeves pushed to her elbows, hands moving with the swift and practiced certainty of someone who had done this 100 times. Nothing in her bearing belonged to a housemaid, nothing in her voice, nothing in the angle of her spine. She raised her head and saw him. Their eyes locked through the steam and the lamplight, and in that single breath, 2 years of meticulous concealment fell apart, as completely and soundlessly as a house of cards touched by a draught. She knew that he knew, not the specifics, not the name she had once used, not the particular night, but the essential truth, the thing she had buried beneath a servant's uniform and a borrowed name. She was not who she had claimed to be. His expression, as he stood gripping the doorframe, told her something she had not prepared for. He was not angry. He was stricken. Polly's fever broke before dawn. The physician, arriving at last, examined the girl and declared that whoever had treated her had almost certainly saved her life. He asked to speak with the person responsible. Mrs. Calloway directed him to Agnes, who answered his questions with her usual careful restraint, offering just enough medical knowledge to explain the treatment, never revealing its true depth. The physician was not fooled. "You have trained formally," he said, not a question. Agnes met his gaze with the steady calm of a woman who had long accepted this moment would arrive. "My father was a surgeon," she replied. It was the first true thing she had told anyone in the house. She found Percival waiting in the library at 6:30 that morning. The fire had burned low. The room held the scent of ash and old leather, threaded with the faintest trace of rosemary she had crushed between her fingers during the night. He stood at the window. He did not turn when she entered, but she read it in his shoulders, in the way his hand tightened on the curtain. He had heard the door. "Your Grace," she said, because formality was the only armor still left to her. "Sit down, Miss Thornbury." His voice was quiet. Not cold, quiet. "Please." She sat. He stayed at the window a long moment, and when he finally turned, his face carried an expression she had witnessed only once before. On the night she had knelt beside him in the mud outside a burning tent and watched him fight to stay conscious. It was the face of a man confronting something he had searched for across years, arriving in a form he had never once imagined. "The surgeon's daughter from Northumberland," he said slowly. "The herbs in the garden, the way you dressed Daniel's hand, the way you flinch at thunder." A pause. His voice fell lower. The voice. "I have heard that voice before, Miss Thornbury, in the dark, in the cold, telling me to be still." Agnes said nothing. Her hands rested in her lap, utterly still, because she had learned years ago that the body could be governed even when the heart could not. "It was you," he said, not a question. The silence that followed stretched longer than any she had ever known. Then, very quietly, "Yes." He crossed the room. Not quickly, nothing impulsive marked his movement. He walked with the deliberate, measured stride of a man who understood that whatever he said next would decide everything. He lowered himself into the chair opposite hers, close enough that she could see the faint tremor along his jaw. The dampness at the corners of his eyes, he made no effort to hide it. "Why did you not tell me?" "Because a housemaid does not tell a duke she once saved his life," Agnes said. And for the first time, her composure faltered, not in her hands, not in her posture, but in her voice, which cracked on the final word, like a branch buckling under too much snow. "Because the woman who saved you no longer exists. She used a false name. She fled service under circumstances that would not survive scrutiny. And she has spent 7 years trying to become someone small enough, quiet enough, that no one would ever think to search for her." "I searched for you," he said. "I have done nothing but search for you." "You searched for a ghost, a memory, not for a servant who brings your tea." "And if I tell you," he said, leaning closer, his voice rough, with something that was neither anger nor gratitude, but something far more dangerous than both, "that the servant who brings my tea is the most remarkable woman I have encountered in 32 years of living. What then?" She looked at him. The fire crackled. Outside, the first grey light of a February dawn had begun to ease the darkness. Somewhere deeper in the house, a clock struck 7, its chime travelling through cold corridors like a pulse. "Then I would say," Agnes whispered, "that your Grace has lived a very sheltered life." He laughed, a small, startled sound, nothing like the careful tones he wore in company, and it broke something open between them. Not a wall, a window. Air rushed in that had been sealed out far too long. He reached across the gap between their chairs and took her hand. She let him. His fingers closed around hers, the same fingers she had pressed against his wound in the dark 7 years ago. Neither of them spoke for a long while, because there was nothing left to say that the silence did not already carry. The weeks that followed were not easy. The distance between a duke and a housemaid is not measured in rank alone, but in the expectations of an entire world that watches, judges, and remembers. The Dowager Duchess, when informed, remained silent for a very long time before she spoke. Well, she has better hands than any surgeon in Harley Street, and considerably more sense than any debutante I have presented to you in the last 5 seasons. I suppose one could do worse. Mrs. Calloway wept, whether from shock, from sentiment, or from the sudden realization that she would need to find a replacement. Difficult to say. The servants whispered, as servants always do, but the whispers carried more wonder than scandal. Agnes had saved Polly's life before all of them, and that act had purchased a currency no title and no lineage could buy. Percival did not propose immediately. He understood, perhaps for the first time in his life, that certain things cannot be hurried. The trust Agnes had lost in the world needed rebuilding, not through grand gestures, through the steady, patient accumulation of small ones. He walked with her in the garden. He asked her to teach him the names of the herbs she grew. He listened when she spoke of her father, of the patients she had treated, of the war, the parts she could voice, and the parts that still lived behind her eyes as shadows she could not yet name. He did not flinch from those shadows. He carried his own. Spring came to Ashworth Park the way it always did, reluctantly, as though the land itself required permission to thaw, and with it arrived a softening that had nothing to do with weather. The house, cold for as long as anyone could remember, began to feel different. Fires burned longer. Curtains were drawn back earlier. The library, Percival's fortress of solitude for the better part of a decade, gained a second chair. It appeared beside the first without ceremony, without discussion, and everyone in the house understood it belonged to Agnes. She occupied it each evening, reading while the Duke worked at his desk. The silence that settled between them carried none of the old weight. It was not the silence of concealment. It was the silence of two people who had learned that words were optional between them. He proposed on an April morning, in the herb garden. No ring, no rehearsed speech, no audience save a blackbird perched on the garden wall, singing since dawn. He told her he had spent 7 years looking for someone who had already found him, that he refused to waste another day calling what he felt by the thin, insufficient name of gratitude. Agnes, who had built her entire life on practicality, on caution, on making herself small, looked down at the man kneeling in the damp soil of her own garden and said, "You will ruin your trousers, Your Grace." Then the tears arrived before she could catch them, and she said, "Yes." The wedding was a quiet affair. The Dowager Duchess insisted on flowers from Agnes's garden, and the chapel at Ashworth Park, unused for a family ceremony in over a decade, filled with the scent of rosemary, lavender, and chamomile. Herbs of healing, herbs of remembrance. Mrs. Calloway claimed the back pew and made no effort to hide her tears. Daniels, whose hand still carried the faint scar of Agnes's careful stitching, stood at the door. He smiled. That evening, when the house had gone still and candlelight burned low in the library, Percival lifted his wife's hand. He pressed it against the scar on his shoulder, the scar she had made, the scar that had carried them here through war, through silence, through 7 years of searching. "You saved my life," he said softly. Agnes turned her hand beneath his, threading her fingers through his own. The gesture was so simple, so complete, it required no answer. She gave one anyway, because some truths, once spoken aloud, become permanent. "You saved mine," she said. The fire burned. The library held its silence, not the cruel silence of things unspoken, but the warm silence of things understood. And Ashworth Park, a house governed by duty for generations, became at last a home. So this story finds its close, not a story of rescue alone, but of recognition. Two people who carried the weight of the same night across years and distance, only to discover that the one they had been searching for was already there, waiting in the quiet, hidden in plain sight. Sometimes, the greatest courage lies not in the saving, but in allowing yourself to be seen. Sometimes love arrives not with trumpets and grand declarations, but with a cup of tea placed just so on the corner of a desk, with hands that know how to heal, with a silence that finally learns to speak. Have you ever discovered that someone you had been searching for, a kindness, a connection, a missing piece, was closer than you ever realized? Share your story in the comments. If this tale moved you, leave a like. Pass it along to someone who treasures stories of quiet strength and unexpected love, and subscribe so you never miss a new chapter. We shall meet again soon, with another story waiting to be told.